Well, welcome to the fourth night of our Diving Deeper lecture series. It's good to see some of you here for the first time. Some of you have been here. Some have been missing weeks. That's totally okay. These are being recorded each week. So if you ever miss one or you need to catch up, or if you're like, did Shelby really say that? You can get those.
I can personally send it to you.
If it's trying to force, I've shared it with the app, but if you don't want to get the app, just let me know. I'll share you the actual just YouTube link. Get past that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just let us know. But yes, it's good to see you guys tonight. Just a reminder that for those who are joining us or those who have been with us for a while, the whole point of doing this is that we're trying to build a good foundation that's going to let us read the Bible better. That's what this first series that we're doing. If we do it again, it might be a different topic, but this first series is we're just trying to go over different topics and themes that will allow us to become chefs. That's kind of the analogy that we've been using, right? Is that there's a big difference between somebody who can cook and somebody who is a chef. Somebody who can follow a recipe, can maybe make something, but somebody who's a chef can follow a recipe or modify the recipe or, look at different ingredients and come up with something themselves. We're trying to give you the tools so that you could be able to do that when it comes to the Bible. We hope that, by the end of this, that Bible, at the end of this whole series, when you read the Bible and you come upon a familiar passage, maybe you'll see it in a new light, because you'll be able to see it with like, oh wait, they mentioned this, or they mentioned that, or oh yeah, this is where this is coming up. A quick review to just catch us up. We all started with the idea of hermeneutics, which is how do we interpret things, and we talked about this idea of how we have our own worldviews, and how our worldviews shape the way we interpret different pieces of communication. We talked about how we really want to find the historical and literary context of a passage, because that will help us be able to view it without our worldview kind of invading into our reading. We looked at Genesis 1 and the creation story to kind of teach us how to do that. Genesis 1 teaches us, honestly, not just about the origins, but how to read the Bible really as well. It showed us how details mattered, how understanding genre mattered, and how when you understood all of that stuff, it really helped us not view something through a Western eyes, but helps us put on our ancient Jewish hats and be able to read it the way they would have. The people who wrote the Bible and received it, most of them lived very near a desert or the wilderness. So we talked about these images of the wilderness last week because they use what they see to describe things. And so it would be good for us to understand what they saw and what they understood, so that way we can understand their descriptions. Just real quick, some of the things we talked about is how the wilderness is this place of enough. It's not a place of abundance, but it is a place where you get enough shade, you get enough water, you get enough food, you get enough whatever to get you through that day. You're not worried about tomorrow. When Jesus said, let tomorrow worry about its own things, it's because like the people who live there, you have enough for today. So really all you could worry about is I need to get through today. And then tomorrow I will hopefully have enough to get through that day. The desert is made up, especially that area of the world, the desert is made up of a lot of these things called wadis, which were these maze-like canyons. You could walk through them and you couldn't see very far ahead, because they were constantly winding back and forth, so it's very easy to get lost in the desert, and you're really dependent on whoever's leading you to hopefully get you through those safely. We talked also about trees that grow in the desert and how they are the picture of that whole idea of enough, that you have the rotum tree, which doesn't really look like a tree. If you guys remember the picture, or if you look that up, it looks more like a bush, but that's a tree. That is the tree that actually Elijah found rest on when he ran away from Jezebel for his life. And then there's the acacia tree. It's a tree that is throughout the wilderness, and sometimes you come on it and it looks completely dead, but it can live up to like 10 years without getting water, and as soon as water comes by, it suddenly springs to life. And so this idea of the desert of like being able to sustain yourself, whether you have plenty or not. Also, we looked at how Psalm 1 is this beautiful picture that a person is like a tree planted by streams of flowing water. Some people think that's the acacia tree because it's coming out of the desert, and then it's put by this endless water, so it's always blooming. Its leaves are always green. And we also talked about the arar bush, which is a bush that looks very appetizing, but then when you go and you pick up its fruit and you open it up, it's full of just nothing. It's just air. And actually, the little liquid that's in there is actually poisonous. And how that often is sometimes used as like, Jeremiah uses that as a picture of saying, this is what it's like for a person who trusts on their own strength. Like they look good until you look at their fruit and you open it up and you realize there's nothing there. The arar, A-R-A-R.
Yeah, it's like AR''.
We also talked about water, how it's very necessary for life in the desert, but it also can be very deadly. We mentioned how one of the number one ways to die in the wilderness is drowning, which sounds very strange when you go there and you see, because it looks like there's no water anywhere. But what happens is there's a flash flood or there's rain up in a mountain that could be like 50 miles away, and the water slowly trickles down and builds momentums. And again, these wadis are these canyon-like things, and if you're in one of these canyons and you start hearing the water, by that point it might already be too late before you can find shelter. And then lastly, we talked about shepherds, how shepherd really brings all these pictures together because the shepherd uses their staff to help guide the sheep, uses their rod to defend the sheep from outside forces, uses their voice to guide the sheep. We talked about how like that whole thing of Jesus saying that my sheep know my voice. It's because literally you could have a bunch of flocks all together and one shepherd could do their call and only their sheep would leave and follow them, whereas all the other sheep would stay there. We also have how as sheep, we really need a shepherd, right? Sheep can't really are not very helpful. They're very defenseless without a shepherd to guide them, without a shepherd to lead them to where there is food, where there is water, keep them out of danger, know that, we can't be in the wadi now because there's a flood coming or something like that. The sheep just totally trust the shepherd, and the shepherd gives them enough. We also, lastly, the big reason we talked about these images of the shepherd of the wilderness is because Eastern thinking is more concrete. Western is more abstract. Last week I asked if you gave a one-word description of God, what would it be? And they're typical. God is omnipotent. God is holy. God is all those things. But those things are all abstract concepts. Like you could maybe come up with a picture in your head, but there's not really a picture. There's not a picture of omnipotence. Whereas in the Bible, over and over and over again, those one-word descriptions are God is my rock. God is my fortress. God is my king. God is it's all things that you can easily picture and you easily know. And so we need to be able to shift our mindset a little bit when we're reading the Bible, because when they're talking about these images and they're trying to describe their experiences, they're using these very concrete ways of explaining something, not an abstract way, which is sometimes we view a story and we see details and we kind of just ignore them, or we think that they're just giving us context, where for them every detail means something. That's how a concrete versus abstract thinking kind of works out. And with all that said, tonight we're going to talk about Torah, aka the law, legal restrictions or guidelines. Yes.
Can we pray?
Yes. And since you said that, why don't you pray?
Great. Lord, thanks for this time. Thank you that we get to, again, spend time studying your word, understanding concepts. And Lord, I pray that this just be a time that we enjoy, that kind of just gives more curiosity, more life to your word. And may we just be enriched by it and grow into who you want us to be. Amen.
Amen. All right, so Torah, sometimes it's used to reference the first five books of the Bible. It also sometimes is just shorthand for Torah's the laws that the Israelites have. The word actually And so this is where we start having to change our mindset. The word actually means more like instruction or direction. Like I said, it can usually be the first 5 books of the Bible. Later on, it's used just to talk about Scripture in general. We're talking about Psalm 1, we can see that. Verse 2 of Psalm 1 says that the person meditates on the Lord's Torah. Psalm 1 was actually thought to be written much later than the rest of the Psalms, but it's showing how that word Torah kind of eventually became just kind of a catch-all for the Hebrew Scriptures. When it references the first 5 books, though, it usually, especially in the Old Testament, you'll see very specifically, it'll say the book of the laws of Moses or something like that. In the New Testament, it's sometimes referred just as the law, which is why we're very common with that. Paul uses that term a lot. Or like in the Gospels, Jesus will say something like Moses wrote or the book of Moses says or something like that. He's referencing this idea of Torah. It is a central theme of the Bible. So we need to understand how they would have viewed it because it is a core thing, right? You see this term pop up all over the place. It is the first 5 books which sets the whole precedent for the rest of Scripture. So if we don't understand this well, we're going to not understand the rest of the Bible well. So with that said, need to talk a little bit about how we think about when we hear the word law. This is from good old Merriam-Webster dictionary, right? When we say law, we say it's a system of rules with which a particular country or community recognizes as regulating the actions of its members, which it may enforce by the imposition of penalties, right? If you go and you speed and you go past a camera and you get a nice photograph of your car in the mail a little bit later with a thing saying, guess what, you owe us this much money, or you still owe us this much money, but you can also go to, a little course to get so that it doesn't show up on insurance, right? That's how we think of laws, right? So when we hear that word, that's usually what pops in our mind, but that's not actually how ancient Near Eastern people thought of laws. And this is something that actually has been, in the last couple hundred years, has actually been something that we've started to realize as scholars have done more and more research. In 1901, this big old thing was discovered. It is the Law of Hammurabi. On the top, you can see there's a picture of Shamash, the god of justice, talking to Hammurabi. Then there's the first top is like this prelude, which is talking about how great Hammurabi is. And then the middle part is a section of laws. And then the last section is an epilogue. It's thought to date back to around 1750 BC, which would be kind of when the stories of Genesis would have been happening. What happened at first is this was often used as like, wow, look at this like ancient law code. Look how fair it is. Look at how like all this legal stuff. I mean, you see Hammurabi's like face started being used as kind of this like originator of legal code. And so as they started studying this and started studying more of ancient Near Eastern people, started realizing some things. First, they first thought that Shamash up there is actually giving Hammurabi like a ring and a staff, like giving him the laws, and then these are the laws. What they realize is actually he's not giving him the laws. It's more like Shamash is just showing these off to show that he has power and that Hammurabi is his representative. So they're starting to realize, okay, so maybe not exactly what they thought. They also started realizing that as they look through it, while it does cover a lot of topics, sometimes it's not quite like some things not always lined up, or some things kind of talk differently. And what they realize is that it's more like, instead of maybe specific laws, maybe what they would call model verdicts. Like this is like the type of verdict that would be a good verdict if this case came in front of you. But eventually they realized it's not even that. Like as they figured out more and more about how law works in the ancient Near East, they realized that ancient Near Eastern laws like this one wasn't to give like these legal precedents, wasn't to give a judge, they could have a law book so that when somebody came before them, they could be like, you broke code, 14 paragraph B, whatever. Like it says here that you weren't supposed to steal your neighbor's sheep, and therefore this is the thing. No, they realized law was to teach wisdom. The reason why law was given in the ancient Near East wasn't to give people like a prescriptive, like this is exactly what you do and this is how you make decisions. It was to teach you what looked good, like how to be wise and how to be a wise judge, so that when a case came before you, you knew what a wise decision of that case would look like. To put it another way, those responsible for the law, judges, officials, or parties, did not read what legal authorities they had in the same way we do. They did not engage in interpretation of the exact words of the text, because the text was regarded neither as autonomous nor as exhaustive, irrespective of whether it was a contract, a decree, or a law code. I know it's a little bit fancy, but basically it's saying like today when we have our law codes, like we try to cover everything, right? I know many of you drive, like when you go through the theory and all that stuff, like there's a big book that they want you to know all of the traffic laws, because it's supposed to cover every aspect, everything you could think of about driving. That's not what these ancient Near East laws did. They realized that they didn't actually cover everything, and they weren't autonomous. They weren't something that was just like, the law's up here and we must follow it. It was more like, okay, I see how that's wisdom. Oh, I see this different situation, so I'm going to decide this way because this is what I've been taught is a wise thing to do. So like just quick compare the two. Modern law, right? Comprehensive, it's covering everything. It's prescriptive. It's telling us exactly what to do, what's going on. And practitioners use precedent in determining application. Basically, when a judge or a lawyer when a lawyer makes an argument, usually they're like, this case that happened over here, this judgment was made, so therefore you should make this judgment here, because all the laws build off of each other. Whereas ancient law is limited in range. It's descriptive, right? It's describing what is wise, what is best to do. And the practitioners use wisdom or divine oracle. Exodus 18 is kind of a famous passage because that's where Moses, after crossing through the Red Sea, he meets up with Jethro, his father. Jethro sees that, like, what are you doing? You seem to be trying to take care of every single, case that's coming before you. Choose some people. And so Moses does that. He chooses some wise people to become judges over different areas. But notice that was all before the law was actually given. Moses doesn't actually have a legal code to give all of these judges he just appointed. He chose wise people who could hopefully make fair calls. And then if they didn't know, they would come up, there would be other wise people that they could go consult. And eventually it would come to Moses if they really had a hard time figuring out what was the best decision. Or divine oracle. We see this like in Numbers 15. There's a story about a guy who's picking up sticks on the Sabbath, and they bring him before Moses, and Moses isn't sure what to do. So he goes and asks God, and God gives the judgment. So sometimes it's not even it's not, let me go flip to my legal book and figure out what the law is. Sometimes it's, let me ask God, and God's going to tell me what the actual law is and what the consequence is. Walton, but this way, our modern case law describes precedent that sets limits on what kinds of rulings the lawyers and the judges are allowed to make. Ancient legal wisdom instead tried to instruct the judge on what rightness and wrongness looked like, so he, and it was usually a man, would be able to produce rightness and eliminate wrongness in his verdicts. To give some quick examples of this in the Bible that we see, hopefully pull out your phones or Bibles or whatever. Can I get somebody to read Proverbs? We're going to have 2 Proverbs and 2 Psalms. Can I get somebody to read Proverbs 6:23? Whoever gets there first, just go ahead.
This is right. Come with me. Does it start with that?
6:23?
I don't know. My Bible's weird. You're right. No, I don't know. Somebody else do it.
Okay.
Okay, I've got it. Verse 23.
Yes, of chapter 6.
Just 23.
Just 23.
Okay. For these These commands are a lamp. This teaching is a light, and the corrections of discipline are the way of life.
So it's a lamp, it's a light, right? These are things that you don't go and stare at a lamp, right? You don't pull out your torch when it's dark outside and point it at your face, right? You're using that to guide you. It's to give you the idea of where to go, what's the best route, not necessarily to technically like guide your hand every step of the way, but to hopefully show you the right path. Proverbs 13, verse 14. You got it?
The instruction of the wise is like a life-giving fountain. Those who accept it avoid the snares of death.
Right? It's a life-giving fountain, right? This is not, again, it's this picture of there's not a instruction booklet. It's to give us life. And as we talked with water can be both life-giving, but also be a little chaotic, right? So it's, again, this picture that we need to change the way we understand instruction, that it's more of this, we're guiding people. Psalm 19, verses 7 through 10.
The instructions of the Lord are perfect, reviving the soul. The decrees of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. The commandments of the Lord are right, bringing joy to the heart. The commands of the Lord are clear, giving insight for living. Reverence for the Lord is pure, lasting forever. The laws of the Lord are true, each one is fair. They are more desirable than gold, even the finest gold. They are sweeter than honey, even honey dripping from the comb.
Right? So, right, it makes people wise. It renews our souls. Like that's the idea of law for them. It's not something that is this like restrictive, like limiting type thing. And finally, Psalm 119:1. I mean, Psalm 119, the whole thing is about celebrating Torah, God's instructions, but just the very first verse of it. Obviously, we're not going to read that whole psalm. Psalm 119.
19:1.
Yep, just the first verse.
Okay, blessed are those whose ways are blameless, who walk according to the law of the Lord.
Who walk according to the law of the Lord, right? It's all of this idea is that it's a guiding, it's a light, it makes somebody wise. I just want to re-emphasize that because that's how we should be viewing this when we're going through, when you're reading these large chunks of just rules and stuff, that's how they viewed it. They didn't view it as like, oh man, look at all these little rules we had to keep. They viewed it as like, oh, what's the wisdom behind this thing that helps me live out a life that is wise and would be it's refreshing in all of that. So you might be wondering, okay, well, what happened? What changes wisdom to prescription? Because we do see a change. We start to see it kind of near the end of the Two Kingdoms period. 2 Kings 14:6 is probably one of the first times where where it's King Amaziah, but it says he didn't kill the children of the people who killed his father, because it says in the book of the law of Moses, sons aren't to be put to death because of the sins of their fathers, nor fathers are put to death because of the sins of their son. It's one of the first times where it's now not so much as a guide, like it's still kind of a guiding principle, but like you can see them starting to quote it in a way. And then this becomes especially clear after the exile with like in Ezra and Nehemiah, especially like when you get to Nehemiah 13, which is this passage of where they're reading through Deuteronomy. They see that in Deuteronomy it says that no Moab or Ammonite is allowed into the congregation of Israel, and immediately they make this decision that because of this they need to have everybody divorce their foreign wives, which I think actually the Bible, some of the other prophets make a comment on, like saying that was a bad decision. And actually one fun thought, one theory that is out there, because we don't know exactly when the book of Ruth, at least our version that we got, the Ruth story is probably much older, but the book of Ruth that we have, some people think was written during that time as kind of a push back, saying like, you guys are saying that, yeah, no Moabite is supposed to be within Israel. Here's Ruth the Moabite, who is the great grandmother of David, you know, like who is more righteous than any Israelite woman. But unfortunately, we start seeing the swing of the word from kind of towards the word of the law instead of the spirit of the law, which comes from a good place, right? Originally, they're coming out of exile. They don't want to go back into exile. They're trying to, how do we follow God in a way that we can do it? And they start, unfortunately, going towards legalism, right? And this leads to a lot of the factions that we get to in the New Testament between the Sadducees and the Pharisees and all of them, right? What is one of the most common complaints Jesus has about the spiritual leaders of his time? Is right that they're like blind shepherds, or they clean the outside of the cup, but they don't clean the inside of the cup. They're like whitewashed tombs. They're like, right, they're now all about tradition and legal and following all these specific rules instead of actually doing what, in his way of actually following the law. Which is why when he comes to the Sermon on the Mount, right, there's a whole section. It now makes sense why he would say, you know, the law says this, but I say this, right? And he's reshaping. I don't think he's reshaping. I think he's bringing people back to the way that God originally intended the law to be. Now, I will say this is a little bit my opinion, but I do think it's clear from the New Testament that we are supposed to go back to this idea of seeing law as wisdom, and that's the way God wants us to understand it and the way us to think. That we're not approaching these commands as like, oh, I got to just follow every single command, right? It's more about what is the wisdom behind these commands, and how can I follow them that way? How can I live a wise life? The New Testament writers, I think, are a great example of this. Like Paul in 1 Timothy 5:18, right? It's this famous passage of why do you pay like pastors or people who are serving the church? Because you don't want to muzzle an ox, right? He's taking a command, which if you take very literally, like if you're thinking that this is just a specific legal code and like you just have to follow these rules, well, that's a very straightforward rule, right? Don't muzzle your ox while it's treading out the grain. Like, okay, if I own oxes, I won't do that. But Paul's saying, oh no, there's a wisdom behind this, that if we view it through the wisdom side, it's saying, oh, we need to make sure that we actually pay people what they're worth, what they're doing, that we don't limit them or keep them from being able to do what they've been called to do. Peter ends in his book, How the Bible Actually Works, says this, and again, the genius of the laws is their ambiguity, not their clarity. For their ambiguity is the very thing that allows them to gain new life with each passing year, ensuring that past and present forever remain connected in a dialogue, right? This kind of goes back to something I mentioned in the very first week, which is that the Bible isn't written to you, right? It's not written. Like in a very strict sense, the people who wrote those different books of the Bible had a very specific audience in mind when they were writing them. And they, unfortunately, it wasn't Shelby Hunt sitting in England. I mean, they wouldn't know what England was, at that point. It doesn't mean that the Bible's irrelevant, though, right? Sometimes that might be the conclusion. Well, if the Bible's not written to us, why do we read it? It doesn't mean the Bible's not irrelevant. It's just it means that we got to come to it on its terms, not our own. So if we see the law as a source of wisdom, I think it makes us think twice when we come to the books of like the last half of Exodus or Leviticus or into Numbers or Deuteronomy. Like sometimes people say this is the most boring parts of the Bible to read. And I think it's because we come to it and we just see all of these, man, look at all these laws that God gave them, all these little commands that they had to follow. Instead, if we see it as like, oh, what is the wisdom behind that? How did it help them live lives that help them represent God well? Because remember, as we find in creation, humans are all created in God's image. Humans' main purpose is to reflect the image of God to those around them. So these laws aren't specific little like commands that we have to follow. They're to give us wisdom on how does it look like to be an image of God? How does it look like to reflect Yahweh to the world around us? One more quote from Peter Enns, and then I'm going to pass it over to Rachel, but I think this is a great one. To put it in Christian terms, wisdom is what forms us to be more like Jesus, who, as the Apostle Paul put it, became for us wisdom from God. Shepherding us toward wisdom, kicking and screaming if need be, that is the Bible's purpose. The Bible becomes a confusing mess when we expect it to fulfill some other purpose, like functioning as an owner's manual for life. But when we allow the Bible to determine our expectations, we see that intending to gain wisdom is our proper spiritual posture towards it. Wisdom isn't about flipping to a topical index so we can see what we are to do or think, as if the Bible were a teacher's edition textbook with the answers supplied in the back. Wisdom is about the lifelong process of being formed into mature disciples who wander well along the unscripted pilgrimage of faith, in tune to the all-surrounding thick presence of the Spirit of God in us and in the creation around us. So, with that said, with that idea of this is how they thought of law and that's how they kind of understood it, I'm now going to pass it over to Rachel, who is going to talk about probably the most famous set of laws in the Bible.
Yes. The 10 words, which is totally what we call it. Now, or the 10 Commandments. They're also called the Decalogue, if you want to be really snooty and smart. Deca, 10, logos, word. Anyway, so this is the 10 words, or the 10 Commandments, are the only part of the law that was actually given directly to the people. So as they're coming out of Egypt, as they're approaching Sinai, God gives them the 10 Commandments, and then they're like, whoa, Moses, you go talk to him. We don't want to hear God's voice. It terrifies us. So these words are special in that they're one of a kind. It makes it, these are also unique in ancient Near Eastern cultures because God's actually telling you what he wants. In most ancient Near Eastern cultures, you would have gods that you'd have to kind of divine what they want. They were very fickle. There was never like a clear understanding of who they were. Like you see with Egypt, they'd have to like search through guts and do other things. But God gives like clarity right off the bat. Another thing to note about these is that, yes, they, I might say it again later, but they were given after they were saved, not before. So the people were taken out of Egypt. So law wasn't given and then they were taken out of Egypt. They were taken out of Egypt and then the 10 words were given. So that's something to keep in the back of your mind. But we're going to focus specifically on what this law or 10 words do for the Israelites in a historical and literary context, as we've talked about in previous discussions. And then what does it mean for us now, which is that sprinkling of reader response. Right. So, can anyone tell me the 10 Commandments?
6 of them.
Okay.
What are
Yeah,
the
go
6
for
you
it.
know?
Tell me the 6 you know. That's fine.
It'll be, there's only one God.
Uh-huh.
You shall worship no other God.
Yeah.
Love thy neighbour as yourself.
Okay.
That might be the next one along.
Yes.
Okay, so we'll skip that one. Then you get all the thou do not commit adultery, do
Yep.
not murder, do not
Yep.
lie, do not covet your
Yeah.
neighbour's whatever.
Get it, Jazz. Get it.
I can't remember it.
That's honestly
okay, it's fine.
really good. Well done, Jazz. Right, but like we've heard them, but we don't necessarily know them all by heart because they may or may not seem relevant to us, or we're not as interested in them, or when we learn them in church, it's not always something that like resonates with us. In fact, there's a scholar named Daniel Block, and he calls like the opening, or really the 10 words, as like the Bill of Rights for the law. But rather than for the individual, it's for the individual's neighbor. And so like when we look at our Bill of Rights, like from the US, it's kind of telling you everything that you can do. Like you have the right not to testify against yourself. You have the right to bear arms. You have the right to vote, those kinds of things. But it's all me-centric. But actually these 10 words are not me-centric. They're community-centric. So we're going to look at how that pans out. And there's actually different ways of counting these 10 words, which that was news to me when I first studied this. So these are our famous 10 words. Yay, they're there. So we have 3 main categories that we number them. So there's a majority Jewish way of thinking about it. There's a Catholic Lutheran tradition of thinking about it, and then an Orthodox and Reformed version of thinking about it. Something really significant is there's a change in thinking between the East and the West when it comes to the first word. You'll notice that there's only one who sees it as a word, which is, I am Yahweh your God. We in the West don't think of that as anything because it's not a command to us. And we're hearing command. Like Shelby said, we're hearing like a list of do's and don'ts. But actually, if you're a Jewish mindset, like ancient Jewish mindset, you're thinking of a word from God. So it has more meaning. So I am Yahweh your God is actually the first word, which really changes the way you think about the 10 words. So we see I am Yahweh as a preamble, but actually in a mindset for the Jewish, they see it as a word. And then we get to the ones that you probably grew up. I'm going to guess that most of us fall into the Orthodox Reform group based on just our conversations and how we grew up and where we're from. But the Reformed Orthodox sees no other gods as the first one. And then the second word would be no images. So like don't make a card image out of anything, right? Whereas the Catholic Lutheran would actually see it as a combined thing. So no other gods and no images, meaning no idols of worship, but not necessarily like you can't see God in things. So in other words, if you're in a Reformed church versus a Catholic church, the way you count this, that's why you'll see statues and pictures of Jesus in one church and none in another. It's because of the way they interpret these 10 words. So that's just interesting to think about. And then the Eastern Orthodox count like Reformed, but they don't see a problem with imagery, but it's just a fun little fact. But the point is, when we come to these words, we need to kind of like take our mindset out of where we're coming from and just see them for something that God is clarifying to us and think about the meaning behind it. Really quick as well, I want to quickly highlight another tool that we may or may not have talked about when reading, and that is a chiasm or chiasm. It's a structure like this. It goes A, B, C, B, A. It could be massive. It could be a few verses. It could be a couple chapters. It could be a couple books. But the whole point of these structures is that centerpiece is the main thought. So in this case, the 10 words, there's a woman who's Dr. Imez. She would argue that the first word or command should be seen as a combination with the preamble because of this structure. And the main point is don't make an idol for yourself. And so when we come to the understanding of the 10 words, that's the main thought behind everything. Don't make an idol for yourself. So it's just something to think about as we move on. So remember, we're talking about abstract versus concrete. We need to flip out of our abstract thinking, get into a concrete way of thinking. But the reason the imagery of like, don't make an idol is so important is it's the worship. So Carmen says that the point of images is worship. The means of worship are images. The prohibition of images underscores the seriousness of the command to worship only Yahweh. The commands make no effort to convince the Israelites that Yahweh is the only God. Instead, they call Israel to worship only Yahweh. And so it's about having another God. Let me say this again. If you don't have a physical idol, then in ancient Near Eastern mindset, you'd have a bunch of idols in your house if you worshipped different gods. But Yahweh is saying, like, don't do any of that. And in our mindsets, we think about, like, we have an idol of money, or we have an idol of relationship and things like that. And that's a little bit more abstract. Yes, I could pull out some money here, but it's really the concept behind it, not the money itself. So we have to, again, think about the fact that like it's really focused more on an image that sits in the house that we're worshiping. So it's more about worship than it is a thing. Because idols equal gods. And that's why early Christians would be seen as atheists, because they don't have household gods in their house. Yes. So with that being said, let's kind of look at the wisdom behind every word. So word 1 is all about who you worship and how. Word 2 is do not bear the Lord's name in vain. That may be a weird wording for you. We'll come back to it, but I want you to remember it. Word 3 is remember the Sabbath day. Why is that important? Because Sabbath commands us to protect the entire household's right to rest. It ensures a rhythm of sustainable living, and you have to prepare for the Sabbath. So it's like a lifestyle that's consistently centered around rest. Honor your father and mother. This is the one that I always loved growing up. Some people, I've been taught this where the other half of honor your father and mother, so that your days are long. And I was like, so am I going to live long if I honor my mom and dad? And it's like, that's not really what it's talking about. Again, these are not about the individual. They're about the community of Israel. So we got to get out of our Western mindset of me, and think about the Eastern mindset of a collective group. And so the idea behind honor your father and mother and you'll live long is that if they forget the faith of their parents, they'll face hardships. When Moses gives the law to the Israelites before they enter the promised land, he's like, do all these things and God will bless you, do all these things, and you're going to get punished because you're reaping those things. Like God will hold you accountable, right? So it's like, which one are you going to follow? You turn a couple pages and you see Judges where a generation apart, they just stop following Yahweh. Everyone does what is right in their own eyes. So it's the idea that, and then they go through a lot of hardships. People die, like bad things happen. And it's because they're not honoring the covenant that they made with Yahweh. So it's the idea that if you honor your father and mother, it'll go well with you because of Yahweh. And it's not necessarily definite all the time, like tick. You must not murder. Not you must not kill. You must not murder. Can't stand it when people was like, you kill an animal to eat it, don't you? But the reason why? Because vengeance is God's, not yours. In the New Testament, we come to a verse, I believe it's in James, where it says, the righteousness, or the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. We're just not really prone to good things when we're angry. And God is the one who can take that vengeance properly. All right, number 6, you must not commit adultery. Why? Marriage is a reflection of Yahweh and his people. And so constantly you see that theme in Scripture, especially in Hosea, where you have a literal picture of a marriage with a whore, and God's like, you forgot me. And he's constantly going back to his people. And the idea is that like you're not honoring me as your God. So marriage is a reflection of that, so don't commit adultery. Word 7, you must not steal. Why? As we said before with Bema, trust the story. God will always give you enough. The minute you steal, you're rejecting that God is giving you enough. Now, word 8, you must not give false testimony. Why? Slander erodes communities. Think about the effect that fake news and social media has on your community, and that alone can make you think about if one of us were to talk bad about the other in our group, it could just fracture relationships. Imagine if we were a community that was purely a collective community where we valued our place in that community over ourselves as individuals. How hard would that be? Don't give false testimony. Live wisely. And 9 and 10, you must not covet your neighbor's house. You must not covet your neighbor's wife or husband or any other household member. Does anybody notice something that's unique about these words? They're in here. It's not enforceable, is it? How do you know if I'm coveting? You have no idea. This is strictly about my contentment with what God has given me. This is not enforceable. I don't even know if you're coveting. I have no idea if you're coveting, Shelby. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. This is about, you need to be content with all things that you were given. So it's remembering those images of the desert. You have enough. You will get through it. You don't need to hope and want for other things. But this is about your heart posture towards the Lord. Okay, so we're going to go back to do not bear the Lord's name in vain, which is my favorite. How do you understand this command typically when you hear this? I'm sure you have different translations that say it differently. How have you normally heard this growing up in church, wherever?
Do not take the Lord's name in vain.
Yeah, do not take the Lord's name in vain, totally. And what does that mean to you? Swearing. Yeah. Here's the problem. That word that we say, take the Lord's name, is nasa. It means to lift or to carry. So a traditional translation view will say that to lift a name means to speak it, like to hold it in high regard. But actually what's going on here, if we think about it in a concrete way, to bear a name is to put the name on you and to carry it around. So you're bearing the Lord's name. So meaning you're representing him to others. So if you think about that in a concrete way, you're bearing God's name. You're an image bearer walking around like a signpost for Yahweh to other people. So this will change the way you think about it. So then let's flesh this out a little bit more. You can see the same idea with seals. So in Exodus 28:36, you are to make a pure gold medallion, engrave it like the engraving of a seal, holy to the Lord. This is talking about the Aaron and the priesthood. Thank you. And so the idea is that Aaron would be sealed holy to the Lord. It would even be written like in this thing that would be on his forehead. So he'd literally be carrying around the Lord's name. So Israel was called to be a kingdom of priests, right? And so in other words, bearing God's name is not about speaking it. It's about representing Yahweh to everyone else. So basically, this is about community. The first two words are about having a right relationship with Yahweh so that words 3 through 10, you can have a right relationship with everybody else. What does that remind you of? How does that apply to us today, right? So if Israel does not keep other commandments dealing with, with the community, then they would be bearing the Lord's name in vain if they don't follow those commands. So then if we're now in the current season that we're in, what does that look like? The same thing will apply to us. So we see in Acts 9:15, this is when Paul is being arrested, and Ananias has got to go to him, and he's talking to God, and God's like, yeah, you need to go pray for him. And I was like, no. And the Lord says, but the Lord said to him, go, for this man is my chosen instrument to bear my name to the Gentiles, kings, and Israelites. It's that same idea. So now we see a connection of Jesus' name and Yahweh's name being linked together. And then we see this over and over again as well in the Old and New Testament reflecting each other, which happens all the time, but this is a particular easy one. Isaiah 45:23, every knee will bow to me, every tongue will swear allegiance. Philippians 2:10-11, so that at the name of Jesus, every knee will bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. So it's, again, equating the name of Yahweh to the name of Jesus. So then the question that's begged is, whose name do you bear? Well, we bear Jesus' name. Another place that really brings this home is 1 Peter 4:14 and 16. If you are ridiculed for the name of Christ, you're blessed because the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. But if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, because let him glorify God in bearing that name. Right? And so when we look at these commands in the second word, it's keeping the command not to bear Yahweh's name in vain changes everything about how we live. Why? Because it's an identity issue. God is reforming your identity with the law. That's the whole point of it. So you're an image bearer. Go and bear his name well so that you love God well and love people well. Jesus says he was asked what is the best, the top law. And he's like, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. Second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. He's reflecting the 10 words. So the 10 words matter to us because we need to reflect God well to each other and to our community. It completely changes the way you think about it, isn't it? And with that, any questions?
Do you want your water?
Yeah, I do want my water. Thank you. It's okay if you don't have them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing that popped in my head as we were studying for this too, that insert in, was that the idea that because we bear his name, bear the name of Christ, it makes sense why Peter would say something like, live in such a way that when the Gentiles see your actions, they will praise your Father in heaven, because of the fact that they would see, because you're bearing the name. They already know that's the name that you're carrying around.
Yeah.
So I was like, oh, that popped up to me too when we were setting stuff up.
Yeah.
So questions, comments, concerns, urges to run screaming from the room. Yes.
I guess a number of the prophets talk about the law being written on our hearts. Comments about that.
Yeah, so the heart is another because the heart we see it as the center of emotions, right? And even sometimes the heart, even when that's written on heart or whatever, sometimes it's not exactly heart, because the center of emotions and stuff for the ancient Israelites was actually your bowels.
The guts.
But it sounds much better to say around heart. But the idea is, it's shaping you, right? The law is literally shaping you so that it is changing your heart, it's changing your guts, it's changing your emotions, because out of your emotions kind of direct what you do. It's shaping you to live a wise life. So by having it written, and that's why you have Orthodox Jews today, or in ancient times, right, they would literally carry a little box on their head that has a little bit of from the Torah, like a verse or two on it, or they would carry it on their wrists, or sometimes around their heart, because that's the idea, is that they're taking this, they're making it very concrete, showing it very well, like this is something I'm carrying around. That's when it comes to the law written on your hearts, that's a big picture, I think, of literally it's the idea of, it's shaping your heart. It's that picture of it's literally they wrote it down onto it, so that you can't go. It's there. You can't go anywhere without it.
I think it's also reflecting back to the spirit of the law, not the letter, because obviously we don't have tattoos on the inside of ourselves. But if you understand, it'll influence you in your actions, right? So it's kind of that same concept. Yeah. It's
like another famous psalm from Psalm 119, right? Your word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path, right? It's the idea that it's the law, the Torah, directs us and provides that way of, this is how you're supposed to walk, Not because you do everything exactly the way it is. I mean, there's a famous story, Saul and Samuel, right? Saul, he goes off, he's supposed to not kill all these, no, he was supposed to wait for Samuel to show up before he started making sacrifices. He gets nervous about the people, so he starts doing these sacrifice things. Samuel shows up and is like, what are you doing? You were explicitly told not to do this. And he's like, but he's like, don't worry, I'm doing it. Isn't this great? I'm sacrificing, I'm doing all this stuff. And Samuel says, God doesn't care about your sacrifices. He'd rather have you be obedient, to follow him. That's the idea of it's not about following the letter of the law. It's about following the spirit of the law.
I think that's probably the question for me. A bit of an eye-opener is the difference between prescriptive and the wisdom.
Yeah.
And that now we work very much on the prescriptive.
Yeah.
The law is based on them. But actually, and we all know that often the law is particularly wise in situations, and that the perfect way to do it is actually probably through the wisdom and the simple wisdom you in for them.
Yeah. It just changes entirely the way you read the Old Testament. And then you start seeing themes of it too in the New Testament. You're like, oh, it's like so different.
I mean, it's like, I know I used this example the first week, but it's I think the most clearest example to me is you have Proverbs, which everybody thinks, you just do exactly what Proverbs says, but then you get to...
It's waste time.
And I think it's Proverbs 24 where you have these two verses, right? One says, don't talk to a fool in his folly, otherwise you're going to be dragged down. And then the very next verse is, answer a fool in his folly, otherwise he'll be wise in his own eyes, right? It's literally like two contradictory verses right next to each other.
If you take it literally.
And the whole point is it's saying, like, I think that's the most clearest image of like saying, hey, you have to be wise to know what to do in a situation.
Yeah.
But people then use it and say, don't they, like, oh, the Bible disagrees.
If you read it from a Western mindset, you see that and you're like, here's an error in the Bible, right? Or here's something where the Bible contradicts itself. When it's really, it's just you understanding what the Bible is actually trying to tell you.
Yeah.
So the verse that comes to me is the fear of the Lord is the wisdom.
Right?
So that
Absolutely.
is it, isn't it?
Yeah.
In a sense.
Yeah. Also, some resources we could offer you. The big one that I love is Bearing God's Name, Why Sinai Still Matters, which is Dr. Imes. She is so great. It's like basically a simplified version of her dissertation. So it's not a hard read, but it's really, really good. And it kind of fleshes out a load of this stuff. And then I'll let you say the other ones.
The Lost World of the Torah is a little bit more academically. If you were here for the creation talk, John Walton also wrote the other book that I recommended back then. A little bit more academic, but not super hard to read. How the Bible actually works is this is something where I don't actually agree with Peter Enns the entire time.
No.
But
he has some good stuff to say.
He has some really good stuff to say. And I think that's actually a really good challenge he's super easy to read. He writes very sarcastically.
He's quite funny.
He's very funny, so it makes it very easy to get through the book.
He's also a doctorate and a scholar.
But if any of you read that, I'd love to hear feedback from you guys of what you think. But the idea of how the Bible points to wisdom, I agree with him on that. And that's like kind of his central point to it. Right. Finally, the Bible Project, if you didn't know, has these online classes that you can take. And Carmen Imes does one that goes right through Exodus, which obviously will cover 10 Commandments, law, all that as well.
Yeah, she's a specialist in Exodus to the point where she's asked to write a commentary on it. So if you want to read something that's like very in depth, she's the one to go to.
So that's just another great source.
Yeah.
I know we recommend, I think, these podcasts every week, but the Bible Project and Bema podcasts are great stuff.
Yeah.
Any other questions, discussion? I mean, it could be ever anything. Doesn't have to be other 10 Commandments. It could be about the law. It could be...
Sorry. Sometimes people make a division with the law and say there's the moral law and there's the ceremonial law. And there's the third one again. And they're like, most of this doesn't matter. It's just a moral law. I guess I never have really liked that because I don't really see the Bible doing that because it seems that sometimes these laws come right next to each other without much distinction. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Because if you think about it, the Israelites are told in Exodus that you're supposed to be a kingdom of priests. And the next book is Leviticus, which is telling you what does a priest look like. Yeah. And so it has laws that sometimes are very specific to the Levites or whatever, but it's also to give them an image of what does it look like that they're supposed to live in such a way that shows different to everybody else. And everything, even some of these ones where it seems like very detailed, like, oh, this is just ceremonial stuff, we can set that aside. But even within Leviticus, this whole idea of wisdom, laws, it's not the letter of the law, it's the wisdom of the law comes through, because you have this story of Aaron's sons who are probably drunk, mostly just because right after this happens, God says, like, you shouldn't come into the tabernacle having drunk wine. But they're killed by God, it says, because it says unusual fire. Basically, they didn't honor God and what he was trying to set up. In other words, they bared the Lord's name in vain in a way, because they as priests carried the Lord's name and they weren't honoring it with the way they were doing things, and so God killed them. And then you read the story about Aaron, and he's not supposed, like Moses tells him, okay, don't mourn, we need to get the bodies out, blah, blah. And then there's another story that's like either I think it's the very next chapter or at the end of that chapter, where Aaron isn't doing one of the sacrifices exactly like what it says or correctly. And Moses is like, why aren't you doing the sacrifice correctly? And Aaron says, it would not be right because of my heart right now after losing my 2 sons. It would not be right for me to do this part of that sacrifice. And Moses is like, oh, that's good. So it's not about, you would think like, wait a second, Aaron's sons didn't, like from a legal perspective, from a Western legal perspective, we look at that first story and we say, if they don't do exactly everything right, God kills them.
Yeah.
And then that should mean that second story should really be confusing to us, because again, we have an additional story that's right after that story of the priests not doing something exactly the way that they were supposed to do it. But you see that it was about their heart. It was about how they came to it. It was about how they bared God's image. It was how they were in relationship with God, and how they viewed it.
Yeah.
So Aaron, in his respect for the Lord, didn't do something correctly, which I think. So to go back to your question about ritual law versus moral law, I think that even in the ritual law, everything's there for a reason, right? And while it gives it's pretty detailed on how you make some of these sacrifices and stuff like that. Even that, when I read that, I think, okay, yeah, a few people show up a day and do this. But then you realize, wait a second, if the people of Israel are like a couple million people, like how many sacrifices are actually happening? And how many actually then have to happen is this actually descriptive of or prescriptive of you have to do every sacrifice exactly? Or are they trying to give you, this is like the ideal, this is the wise way of giving a sacrifice and a wise way to bring it before the Lord?
And ultimately, your worship is centered and focused on God. Your heart, your love.
And the other part about this is that reason why I don't think it's a separate between moral and sacrifice is that it's a testimony to the people around them, because other gods, you sacrifice to please that god or get something from the god.
Appease.
You have to appease the god in order to do it. The Israelites aren't sacrificing to appease God or give him something he doesn't have. That's also the other reason why you would sacrifice. You're sacrificing to God because you're giving him food. You're giving him something that they need so that you can get something from them. God doesn't need anything from the people. The sacrifices are all about the covenant relationship.
So how would you explain it to the modern mindset that says, "Oh, well, even my mind actually, God is harsh."
Yeah. So.
My sons,
Yeah. So this. It all comes back to how do we read it as, are we reading it as Westerners, or are we reading it as ancient Near Easterners? Because that story of, that seems harsh. God kills these 2 people. But at the same time, we're seeing a few different things. One, it's really establishing the fact that this is a being that has saved them, that has made a relationship with them. I remember, I think actually from the Bema podcast, they talk about how you can look at the first 5 books as almost the story of a Jewish wedding, So whereas with the 10 words, like there's a part of a Jewish wedding where you come and you give your vows to each other. And so like with them being at Sinai and God giving them like the commandments and stuff, that is them making that
The vow.
the vow. And then there's a
Right.
period where you learn how
Yeah.
to be in relationship
Yeah.
with each other. And that's kind of Leviticus into Numbers. So it's how, I think there's this wisdom picture of like, God is very loving and very close to his people, but at the same time he's still a very powerful being.
Also,
Okay,
if
you go.
I may, sorry. Also, you got to remember that these people have agreed to, like, they have vowed, they have agreed to be in covenant, and these are priests, one generation away, who are supposed to represent God to the people. So if they're not doing it properly on the onset and God doesn't deal with them, it says something about God's character as well.
I think also, I think it was Tim Mackey in one of his podcasts was talking about this and about this specific story. And he said it's like, it's realizing like the sun is a great thing, right? Because the sun provides light, it provides warmth. Well, when it's out, it provides warmth. This last weekend we got to experience that. Yeah, right?
And color.
But that doesn't mean you can go walk on the sun, right? Doesn't mean that you can go up to it. So there is a point of like, there is that like honor and like understanding. That's also a big thing too. Ancient Near East, much more honor shame society.
Yeah.
Much more about the community, much more about like, so it's doing something wrong isn't necessarily like what we would think is bad. What makes it bad is that you brought shame to somebody or you brought
dishonored
shame
them.
onto yourself. Yeah. That is what makes the actions really bad. So by coming to God, you're bringing shame on him. And so
And you bear his name.
And when you're bearing his name, it's like there's a story also in I think it's Numbers. It might be Exodus, but I'm pretty sure it's Numbers. Or maybe it's Leviticus. No,
Okay,
I think
anyway,
Leviticus.
it's one of those.
There's where it says that there's a fight between an Egyptian like that came with them and a Jewish person, and it says the Egyptian struck the Jewish person, but in the actual like literal like Hebrew, it says that he struck the name of God, and because of that, he was put to death. Not because it wasn't this like. It's this interesting thing where it's not this like, oh, there's a physical brawl and they put him to death. It's like the way they word it is that he somehow, by striking this Hebrew, it was done in some way, or it says he blasphemed. Sometimes we translate it as he just blasphemed the name. It's literally he struck the name. He somehow...
He did something.
He did something where it was literally he did something to bear the Lord's name in vain. And that is the reason why all this stuff happened.
Yep.
But yeah.
Yeah.
I just discovered something tonight for the first time.
Okay.
Well, we've been going through the Ten Commandments,
Yeah.
and I always thought the first commandment was to love your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. Actually, in the original.
So that's in Isaiah, Deuteronomy 6. That is the Shema. So it's a very famous saying, Deuteronomy 6, the Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind.
Is that an additional command?
I think that is more of like just...
Paraphrase?
I think it's a general paraphrase. I think that is like, it's like literally, it's near the beginning of, in the Deuteronomy, and before, in the beginning of the section where he's going to start explaining basically the law all over again. But it's setting that up. Just like how the Jews view, I am Yahweh, your God, as not a separate from the 10 Commandments, but because again, 10 words. It as the first word, like, because it sets the foundation. So in other words, like again, it's not a for them. I think the hard word is we use commands all the time.
We do.
And we even translate these things as commands and stuff. When a lot of the like, you realize the like kind of nuance behind it is it's more about guidance. It's more about instruction. It's more about, it's not like you observe the Lord's instructions. Like it's like it's not, we take it when we translate it, we try to make it to terms that we understand, but I think it also separates us a little bit more in that way. So like even, calling that, is that a command? I think it's just, this is the foundational truth that everything's built off of.
Yeah.
You love the Lord your God.
Talks about the 2 commandments.
Yeah.
Yep.
Is it to the rich young ruler?
Yes.
Rich young
it's
ruler
the,
is
it's the rich.
No, there's a lawyer that comes up to him to ask him about what's the 2 greatest
Yes.
commandments. The rich young ruler asks him, like, what should I do for salvation?
And he's like,
and he
sell
gives,
everything.
notice he lists first, he lists the, like, that second part, the don't commit adultery, don't commit murder, don't give false testimony. And the rich young ruler says, oh, I've done all of those things. And he said, oh, this is the one thing you lack. Sell everything, give it to the poor, and
then
follow me. And it's basically, you give everything away to the community, because remember, it's all, the 10 words are all about the community. It's not about you, it's about how you live in community with each other and how the community responds to God, which also is another interesting way. Read that as not just an individual, but as Israel. Israel, you shall not murder. Israel, you shall not commit adultery, right? That makes it completely different than if individual. But then, and that's why he goes away sad, because he's not willing to sell everything and follow him.
Costs.
Which, that first, it's interesting by not doing that, it's like he's giving up on the first 2 words. He's giving up on the words of not having only God, only following, worshiping after God, and also not bearing God's name. Because it's like, it's too costly for him. He's willing to do the other ones and be okay in community with there, but it becomes very costly to become in right relationship with the Lord.
Just another side note that's also fun to think about. If Jesus is the Word, and you think of the 10 words and what they mean in wisdom, it's just kind of a fun connection to kind of read that through the Bible and think about how, like, Jesus represents wisdom and how that has a little bit more meaning than just, like, physical word. Yeah. Anyway. Yeah, good questions, guys. Really good. Any others before?
We still have time.
I mean, we have plenty of time, which is weird. Usually we don't. Maybe you do get the hot chocolate. Yeah.
So I just what I was actually going to ask is that obviously I know you said that we're hasn't come to check out the law.
Yeah. Yeah.
It almost feels like what you're saying is actually
Well, it doesn't say he's come to abolish law, but to fulfill it.
Yeah.
So in other words, in a way, he's giving the ultimate way of wisdom. He's not abolishing it. He's not saying that the law is now no longer wise. It's like it's
defining it. Kind of like setting it back the way it should have been.
Because in Jeremiah, I can't remember. 28.
We're in giant Jeremiah. He gives this idea. He makes the proclamation about how, like, 70 years they'll be in exile, come back. But he says that there's going to be this new covenant. And the way he describes the new covenant, right, because these 10 words establish the first covenant, is that's where you get the written on their hearts. They're not going to have to be, they're going to just know God. They're not going to be taught about God. Like, it's this all, like, everything's going to be slightly different because of this new covenant that's coming. And then I feel like Jesus picks up on that too, where it's not that he's come to abolish. It's not that the new covenant abolishes or puts away it brings it to a new light, right? We can now, Jesus said all of the law and the prophets were written about him, all point to him, which means that when we go back, if he's the ultimate source of wisdom and the law was to give us wisdom, we should be able to go back and see something new in it, because it's pointing towards him and it's showing us wisdom and how to live like him. Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
What were you going to ask?
So, I think you've spoken about wisdom and the law sort of pointing towards that. Do you think that sort of wisdom, that God kind of has a choice, or could have given a different type of wisdom? So, for example, one of the 10 Commandments is do not steal, which presupposes personal property. Do you think that God could have chosen to give wisdom where it says, actually, there is no personal property, everything just belongs to
That is interesting.
just as the disciples have everything in common? Does God somehow get to choose, I guess, the wisdom that sort of, or the principles that stand behind those laws?
Well, what's interesting is even the do not steal, right? Because they are in a community like ancient Near East and even a lot of modern Near East are like hospitality is like built into the culture. Like people, I was listening, one guy is talking about how like the Bedouins, which are the nomadic people over there, like he'll take groups, like he gives tours through Israel and stuff, and he'll take groups to a Bedouin, like he'll see a nomadic people, and he'll take a group of Americans to this nomadic, like where there's tents, and they will immediately they will make bread. He said like they would be willing to give up the last bit, like use up all their flour to feed the stranger coming to them, to let the stranger go away hungry. So with that mindset of this is what the type, like this is the kind of type of people that you would have. To steal, I think, is such an interesting thing to think that, like, because you said like steal implies personal property, yet the people seem, because it's such a much more of a community face, it'd be more natural for them to just naturally share with each other. In fact, you have, when you get to like the year of Jubilee and stuff like that, he even says, actually, you don't even own all the land. I own the land. I'm kind of giving you, it's like I'm loaning the land to you, and you give back to the people that originally had it, because it's not even yours to begin to sell or own or anyways.
But to a point, in as much as 3 days is the limit. You can share in what's yours is mine for 3 days. After 3 days, then other rules kick in a bit.
But to go back to that, stealing, what stood out to me with that one was like, in a culture that already is so willing to already help you out and be generous.
Stealing is very...
Like, how much do you need to want that thing to steal something from somebody else?
I have thoughts, but...
Oh, go ahead.
No. I don't want to cut you off. I just want room.
That's fine. You go.
Okay. I would also say, like, remember, these are given to them as they come out of exile in Egypt. So, like, everything that they have has already been given to them as well. They were slaves. They only have what God caused the Egyptians to give to them, right? They don't have anything of their own necessarily. If they did, it would be so small anyway. And so you have a reshaping of like your worldview and your identity in these 10 words. So they're all being reorientated off of you're a slave in Egypt, your worth is by how many bricks you make, into you are a people who bear my name, this is what it looks to be called mine. So it's like all of these things are centered around those shifts. So if you're looking at it, even the question that you're asking actually is very Western in its way of thinking, because you're coming at it from a 21st century mindset of, well, what about this and that? It's like, I don't even know that they thought that way. That's how we think in our own culture, because we get to own, we get to have, we think of ourselves, like even your family, like even if I were to include Shelby in my stuff, still my pillow, not his pillow, you know what I mean? But like even so, it's still like, I have purchased it and I own it. So it's like the way we think about it is very different to how they viewed Yahweh and Yahweh viewed them. So yeah, it's just like a really interesting thought process, but either way, the heart of all of these words is to reorient them towards who they are as God's people and their identity as God's people.
I guess sort of the question, or perhaps the follow-up question would be, do you think sort of God would ever sort of give some kind of law, not because he really wants them to do that, but more just he wants them to be obedient, or like maybe it's just a crazy thing. Maybe there's no, like, I don't know, there's no
so yeah,
good in it.
Yeah. I think what Carmen Imus states in her book, and I haven't read other scholars, so I can't reflect it. She does, but I haven't looked at all the cross references. But she often says that, like, the reason why the laws look kind of weird and wonky when you go through them is because it's probably that something happens, God gives them a law. They go about life, do. Oh, this ox got stuck in a ditch. What do I do? Blah, blah, blah. And then a law is given, and then you go back. And so it's like, this is the wisest thing in this situation. But it doesn't mean that every single situation is like that. But I think that kind of gives more clarity to why the law is the way it is and how it was given, because it probably wasn't all given like, slam, here is the book, all the things, it covers all the stuff. Like, that's just not how it goes. So I think based on what she says, yes, the 10 words were given at one time, but the rest of the law wasn't given all necessarily at the exact same time. So it could have been like situational.
I also think, with going along with what you just asked too, like thinking about it, I'm gonna say no. I'm losing
Wakanda.
No, don't lose it. Yeah, help me.
Sorry.
State your question again real quick, because I had it.
Do you think that perhaps God has a choice in some of the laws that he gives, and that perhaps he just chooses one specific thing to see whether they're just going to do it? Like maybe the food laws, I don't really know if there's a rationale, but maybe God just chose it in a particular way to see whether they do it.
I think there is a little bit of that. And I think maybe not so much, I would think the easiest one to see this is probably manna, right?
Yeah.
He tells them to gather just enough for themselves. And some people gather a ton, some people a little, but they always end up with just enough for the day, right? I think and he says that was for a test. Like, there are some times where God says, I'm going to do this, I'm going to tell you this, and this is a test to see if you will follow me or trust me. Because at the center of everything, I think the number one thing that you see throughout Scripture, especially when it talks about law and obedience, is who is somebody facing and following or trying their best to follow. I think about, and this is the thought I had, and I got it back.
Yay.
So I think about like David, and he's called the man after God's own heart.
Oh, yeah.
And yet he does horrible things, right? But he is still called the man after God's own heart, because even at it's this focus of when he does a horrible thing, he turns and he faces the Lord. And so it goes back to what is that heart posture that he has. So I think there is times where God can give a command or something to see as a test to see if what their heart posture is. So yeah, the obedience, but is it? I think for God, the picture is the obedience is not coming from the letter of the law. You're following the letter of the law. The obedience comes because you're following Yahweh. You're following, like, even if you don't get it perfect, because you tried, because he can tell that you're trying to follow and do what he has said to do, that he cares about. At least I see that over and over and over again. It's more about the relationship.
Not that check, I did the thing, but
Yeah.
that I'm loyal.
Yeah.
It's loyal love.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Jesus says, if you love me, you'll obey me.
Yeah.
Loyal love.
And going back to even your previous one, a question about that was like, yeah, I think God could, like, why does he say, do not steal, instead just say, like you don't have possessions, everybody has things. I think in a way, do not steal in their mindset says the same thing, because it's saying that everybody should be so generous that you should never have to steal, right? Like, stealing means that you don't trust that you have enough. You must take either you, actually, even if you have enough and you take something else, you're still probably doing it because you don't feel like you have enough, right? Stealing shows that your heart attitude isn't, it's okay, God will provide, I'm content with what I have, or I know that I can trust the people around me enough that they are going to give it to me. I don't need to take it. I can go ask. Like I know I can go ask Karen for some sugar or something like that, because, there's
Exactly
plenty.
where it is.
Yeah, exactly. Right?
I get it all the time.
But like, we don't have to have that fear of like, oh no, I've run out of something, I guess, and I don't have money to go buy it. I'm going to go steal it.
Guess I'll go through my neighbor's window.
Right? But it's like, the idea of like, if we live in a community where it's like, oh, I'm out of something, I don't have enough money to buy it, but I'm not worried because I know either I'm just going to be content with what I have, or I live in a community that I can just ask. I have all these other people that I love and trust, and they love and trust me. And because of that, I know that they'd be more than willing to help me out in this situation.
I think that still happens. I'm not a Dads can tell me, but I think that still happens a lot in those communities.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, when you read certain books and that, those communities, you realise that's just a kind of very much part and parcel of their lives together.
Yeah.
And here it's a bit of a, we have to have a blooming COVID thing out. And actually,
There's been other examples. Yeah.
But don't you think that's what makes it really hard? Because it makes what we're trying to live God's way so countercultural here.
Yeah.
So it's like it really is.
Yeah.
Because I think it's really struck me because you were saying about it being laws for the community.
Yeah.
And we're such an individualistic
Yeah.
society. It's like,
Yeah.
no wonder it's
and I don't think
Yeah.
it used to be. That's
Yeah.
years and years
got
ago.
worse.
Yeah, there are shifts for sure. Luckily, you're not as individualistic as our culture, so you're still doing okay, but you're a little bit more this way. But I mean, that's also going back to like the law in and of itself. The idea is to meditate on it day and night, right? So it's like, don't just think of the literal words you're seeing, but consider the wisdom behind it. How does that apply now? What does that look like now? Like, that's the whole point of meditating on the law. That's considering what God wants for us in our community to bear his name well. Yeah.
I keep coming back to these, what I thought earlier, but
Yeah.
I just found it in Mark 12.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
One of the teachers of the law came to Jesus and said, which is the most important?
Yeah.
Yes.
And he didn't quote, do not do this, do not do
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
He actually gave the two positives,
Yep.
to love God and to love
Yeah.
your neighbour,
Yeah.
Yeah.
which is, the very opposite of what
Yeah.
a lot of people think is,
Yeah.
thou shalt not.
Yeah.
God gave the positive.
Yeah. I would.
And sell everything you've got and give it to the poor.
Well, that's a different.
Well, that's a
That's a
different
slightly
one.
different story.
It's a different story.
Oh, yeah.
But I would also no. It's okay.
If you actually
Yeah.
read what Jesus quotes, he
Yeah.
says,
Yeah.
you need to love your neighbour as yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't want to steal from yourself.
Yeah.
All that,
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's actually saying, really think about how you communicate with your neighbour, but more importantly, how you your relationship with God, with Jesus.
Right.
Yeah.
With God.
I think it's really interesting that you said those are the only two positives, when in reality, all of them are positive because you're always putting community above yourself. You're always orientating yourself towards Yahweh if you follow those. They're all positive.
Yeah.
They're not negative. It's really interesting. Just consider that. I'd chew on that a little bit.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Because if you're
Eastern teaching.
yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I'll stop.
No, it's
But
okay.
anyway.
That's like we said. Eastern teaching, the way they teach is they embed the meaning into the thing, and they hope that you will discover it because you know how to read it correctly. That's why
Right.
chiasm is
A plus B equals C. It's how did that work this time?
yeah. That's why we
How
wanted
did
to
that
point
impact
out that
person?
little thing
What's
of
their name? What's their sister's? Blah blah blah. Whatever.
We
Anyway.
pointed out that chiasm because chiasm is like a treasure map that it's all once you start to know what it is.
Oh man, you're
and
gonna see it
especially-
everywhere.
You will start seeing it everywhere.
Yes.
But I mean, if you read something and you see one phrase and then you see another phrase similar, like at the end, that's probably a flag that you're reading some kind of chiasm, and you need to start comparing. Oh wait, these two match up. Oh, these two match up. Oh, these two match up. Oh, here's the middle.
Yeah.
Oh, that's the point.
Yep.
If you want to practice this, an easy way to do it is the Book of Ruth.
Yeah.
Just take like chapter 2. And like just compare, like read through chapter 2, and then compare what is the first thing that happens and the last thing that happens, and then what are the next set, and then what are the next set, and then what are the next set, and you'll start realizing,
They reflect each other.
They reflect each other, and because the meaning is in those reflections, And the meaning is, and where does it all point to the center?
It's really fun once you find it.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, when we're going through Isaiah, and I'm noticing it way more, but it's giving so much more depth to our readings that I just never would have caught before. Doesn't mean we always read like that, but like sometimes I'm like, oh, wait a minute, I just said this.
Yeah.
Where did I first say that? It's just something to be curious about.
Anything else?
I've sometimes heard that the law is like a pyramid. So kind of at the top, you have love the Lord your God, your neighbour. And what does that mean? It's the Ten Commandments.
I see.
What do the Ten Commandments mean? What is all these other laws? It's do not commit your neighbour's boundary stone also. That's stealing.
Okay.
And I found that a helpful way of thinking. It's kind of going in layers. Deeper to try to give some concrete examples of sort of, I guess, that wisdom.
Yeah.
Sort of how do we explain those books?
I like that picture, but I would almost flip it up, be an inverted pyramid.
Yep.
Where you have this, and then the layer. Why is you do this? Where you go one layer underneath, and then it's this. Where you, and then eventually you go down to the, I am Yahweh, your God. Right. That's the core.
Either way.
Either way, it works. But yeah,
we get you.
Yeah.
We're with you.
I
Yes. You know, that is helpful. The other thing too is like if you're a brand new people of God and you've only known slavery in a foreign country for 400 years?
Yeah.
It's going to take a while to reorient your thinking. I'm not sure a book of rules is going to do that for me, right? Like I need baby pieces, baby steps. And the most important things are what does my God actually want? But how loving is he that he actually told me what he wants rather than me having to guess at it through what I may or may not do right. So.
When they were slaves, would they have had very hard and fast rules with very specific consequences?
Probably.
Egypt.
Yeah.
I mean, I would assume so. I mean, if you're a slave.
So
don't really have
last
any
week
rights.
we talked about like a shepherd, right? And we talked about how the rod is actually a comfort thing. I mean, the staff is a comforting thing because it's not there to punish the sheep. It literally is there to guide. The crook is not to like somehow like grab a sheep and drag it along. The crook is there because if a sheep gets stuck in a it's actually
you
to get
pull it out.
Lit, and it's always done gently to lift them up.
Right.
It's not done like it's not I'm angry at my sheep and I'm taking my anger out on it.
Like never.
But they're coming out of Egypt. Pharaoh was often pictured in hieroglyphics and stuff with a rod, with a because his thing is his scepter is this.
I like an iron rod.
Iron rod. It's this symbol of authority that he uses to beat the other people down that are underneath him. So there's this picture throughout Scripture of Israel, Israel that God's telling him, "Hey, I'm not coming at you with this iron rod anymore.
Yeah.
You don't have
Egypt.
You're not under the iron rod of Pharaoh. You're under the shepherd staff of Yahweh." And so, there's this.
There's if that's true, then obviously they must have had something that was pretty drastic. I would think they would know, oh, if I do X, Y, Z, I will die. Or if I don't make enough bricks, I'm out.
I'm wondering actually if it was kind of the opposite from hard and fast rules with specific consequences, where it's like, we can just make up on the spot whatever we want. And that real uncertainty of that you're okay.
Yeah, I think it was more of an assurance of that, because it's more of you're teaching people that were taught for 400 years that their only worth is how many bricks that they can make.
Yeah.
If they didn't make enough bricks, they were worthless, they could be discarded.
Yeah.
And now, without them having to make any bricks for Yahweh, without them having to do anything for Yahweh, Yahweh comes in and saves them and brings them out of that land. And now that he's trying to reorientate their thinking into, you don't have to worry about making your worth being tied to bricks anymore.
Right. Your worth
you
is
are
tied
worth
to my name.
stuff because you are saved, because I saved you. Not because you were amazing or you did anything great or anything like that. It's because I chose you and I brought you out of that slavery. So it is a little bit of that like it's okay. You have enough. You can trust in me. You can be at peace.
It must so break his heart, the religions now that are still having to earn their way to heaven.
Yep.
It must break his heart.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think God's enjoying that very much in general. Yeah. I hope we answered your question. I don't know if we did, but I hope we did.
I don't know. Yes, I suppose I was just trying to compare what they'd come from.
Yeah.
Might be a good study to look into. Like maybe consider like what did ancient Egypt do with slaves, and maybe look up some articles through the library or something of like what did that actually look like. I know if you go through a history or anthropological lens, you will probably find it.
Yeah.
But it is an interesting thing to think about. Yeah. But I can't say I know for sure.
And that's helpful because then you know that historical context, so then you can read.
And then you can teach us.
And that's true.
Get up here, Heidi.
I mean, one of my secret goals throughout this is that, I love teaching, but the reason why I keep saying I want you guys to become chefs is that I think it would be awesome if we did another series later, and you guys could help lead some sessions and stuff. Because maybe you guys are like, I really am passionate about a specific part of scripture or a specific type of thing. So I'm going to go off and learn some stuff and then come share with the rest of us.
Yeah.
We grow together. Iron sharpens iron, right?
Yep.
Like I'm more than happy to share with you guys because I think this stuff's cool and I want other people to know about it, you know? And if you guys think that's cool, I want you to share it with me so that I can know about it, so that we can become more just mature followers of Christ together.
Yeah. Cool. Well, with that, I would say our time is about up.
Yeah, so why don't I pray to close us? And then, we'll have
Feel free to get another drink.
Feel free to get another drink
or
and
if
hang
you're
out.
done,
Yeah.
you can leave in peace and love. That's all right, too.
All right, God, thank you so much for tonight. Thank you so much for just... Thank you that you gave us 10 words that were not, like, condemning. They were not... They were there to help us know how to live good lives, honestly. That when we think about it, if we could be a community that lives out those 10 words, how amazing would our community be? God, I pray that we will bear your name well. Jesus, I pray that as we walk around, that it'll be easy to see that we carry your name on our shoulders. And God, I pray that we will be accurate representatives of who you are, so that people will see us, want to get to know more about you, and glorify you, God. In your name, amen.